Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Karel Capek's novel, War with the Newts. This is often sort of glossed as an allegory for the rise of Nazism. And I'm not 100% sure I really see that. There is some merit to that argument, certainly, but the thing that makes it difficult for me to really agree with that assessment is that I'm not sure which side is supposed to be the Nazis, the humans or the Newts. So basically, what happens in War with the Newts, broad brushstrokes, Captain von Toch, who's actually Czech, but and that's largely because Capek was Czech, and so he sort of wants his own country centered in a story that's largely about events going on in the oceans, even though what's now the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia at that time, no coastline. But von Toch is a sailor on a pearl fishing mission. And one of the things we get very early on is actually this critique of colonial economics from von Toch. Basically, he critiques the European colonial administrators and business people for whom he works for basically stealing all of the resources of the various Pacific islands, Polynesia, Melanesia, Micronesia, etc., today, Hawaii as well, all of these places. So he critiques that they have stolen all of these resources, but also that they then sort of send people like him out to discover new things that can then be plundered. And that's really interesting, both because it sets us up in the context of Capek's critiques of sort of capitalist exploitation and the sort of brutality of it, which we see in RUR as well. And then we see later on with the treatment of the Newts as they become more central to society. So von Toch is out. He's supposed to be finding new areas for pearl fishing. What he actually finds is this very, very isolated species of extremely large, like 4 foot tall, extremely intellectually developed salamanders. They clearly have a social order, but they are basically trapped in this bay, this particular bay, in part because sharks keep attacking them, and so they can't really escape. They can't really access sufficient resources for them to multiply, etc., etc. Von Toch sort of realizes that this is an amazing discovery, and because the Newts had seen his pearl divers prying oysters off of the rocks at the bottom of the ocean, the Newts actually sort of bring von Toch just goes to the beach to like see if he can learn more about them, and they like bring him very tentatively at first this oyster, and he pries it open for them looking for a pearl, and he finds a small pearl in it, and he lets the Newt eat the oyster, and it's like so happy that it got to eat this oyster, because normally they can't get into them. So that's the whole sort of start here. What von Toch realizes is if he can transport some of these newts to other islands that may have pearls, they can get way more of them than any human pearl diver, because they can just stay underwater for hours on end. They don't need to come up for oxygen. And if he can train them to sort of pry open the oysters and find the pearls and just bring back the pearls, that makes his life way easier. and he can corner the pearl trade. The problem is he doesn't have the capital for this. So he goes to his friend, sort of friend, this guy that he was acquainted with growing up, G.H. Bondi, who's now a big-time business person. And Von Toch basically says, listen, I've got this way to get a ton of pearls. Here's 15 of them. It's going to be super, super easy. You supply me with the capital. I'll outfit this boat the way I want to do it. And then it's going to be super easy. I've got these newts, these salamanders. There's no real risk here. Just put up the capital and you'll make a ton of money. Which works initially. They get massive amounts of pearls and they sell them. The problem is that then the price of pearls drops, which means their business model is no longer profitable. About the same time, Von Toch dies. And so the company, doing what companies do, say, all right, we're going to just fucking exploit this labor resource for as much as we can. There's now tons and tons and tons of newts because we've taken them out of that environment in which they were constrained in their population size. We've put them out in the world. We're feeding them. They're breeding like newts. No, they're breeding like rabbits, basically. There's just thousands and millions of them. They're expecting exponential growth of the newt population without some sort of alternative factor being introduced. So what they realize is these newts are very, very good at constructing stuff underwater because they naturally build dams and things underwater, levees and stuff like that to restrict the activities of the tide so that they have sheltered places to lay their eggs, etc., etc. And so what the company realizes is that they can train newts to do underwater construction, and they can then sell those newts or rent those newts or whatever it is, whatever model they settle on, which is ultimately sale, basically, to companies, to governments, to various organizations that want to do any sort of underwater construction. They want to artificially expand their coastlines because this becomes a thing. They basically have newts sort of bring in more soil from the bottom of the sea and sort of stack it up along the coastline to create more land, or they do concrete extensions of continents, etc., etc., giving people more land, more space, more resources, or more like farming, arable land, etc., etc. All of this stuff. The newts are very, very good at it. And they get sort of divided up into different classes. There's eventually leader newts who are sort of in charge of sections of working newts, and they're the most intelligent, and they're good at like problem solving and coordinating and stuff like this. You've got heavy newts who are very big, the largest, strongest newts, and they do, again, sort of heavy type labor. Then you've got regular worker newts. Then you've got a bunch of random others who aren't necessarily good for much from a labor perspective. And so they just sort of get sold by the ton and apparently mostly sent to China, where, according to the author, nobody seems to know what happens to them. And then you've got macaroni newts, which are wild newts who are sort of kidnapped by pirates and basically just slave traded as the lowest quality newts that anyone might want for working. And they're called macaroni newts because the pirates basically just stun a whole bunch of them, chuck them in often not very sanitary or clean containers, and then somewhat like the transatlantic slave trade, just take them away, often with appallingly high death rates. Like, at one place in the novel, it says, among these pirated newts, you have a 20 to 30% survival rate. So if they capture 100 newts, they expect, at best, that they'll be able to sell 30 of them. Because the conditions are that horrible, and they're that violent with them. Whereas with the regular sort of corporately run, still basically slave trade in newts, they have about a 10% death rate. The newts also become objects of social curiosity, scientific curiosity, legal debates about the rights of countries in terms of how they construct things and how newts can interact with human beings and whether or not the newts have rights as such. The newts become subjects of artistic curiosity or inspiration with these sort of like newt-inspired arts and things like this. They become philosophical objects, largely about these sort of nihilist philosophers who predict the doom of humanity, etc., etc. And while all of this is happening, the newt population is ever expanding. They're becoming more proficient with tools, more proficient with construction methods. They are being used for coastal defense as a sort of underwater military by countries with coastlines. They're setting underwater mines. They're building fortifications. They've been given weapons that work underwater, torpedoes and mine guns and things like this. The newts are becoming a major force to be reckoned with. And the world economy, the world militaries cannot function without them. I think you can see where this might be going. So, in the very, very final section of the novel, it really is the end of the book, where we finally get the war. The newts start basically collapsing huge sections of coastline, collapsing river systems, etc., etc., and just sort of sinking them into the sea. And then there's a broadcast from the chief newt, the chief salamander, I think is his official title. So he comes on the radio from this underwater this boat-based transmission station. Basically, he says, part of what he says is, "Hello, you men, Louisiana, Kangsur, Senegal." These are the three areas where they initially do their sort of testing and demolishing land as such and driving it into the sea. He says, "We regret the loss of human lives. We don't want to cause you unnecessary casualties. We only want you to evacuate the coast in places that we shall warn you of in time. If you do not, you will avoid. If you do that, you will avoid unfortunate incidents. Next time we shall let you know, at least a fortnight ahead, where we are going to enlarge the sea. So far, we have only been carrying out trials. Your explosives have done well. We thank you. Hello, you people. Don't get excited. We have no hostile intentions towards you. We only need more water, more coasts, more shallow water to live in. There are too many of us. There is not space enough for us on your coasts any longer. Therefore, we must break down your continents. From them, we shall make bays and islands all around. In this way, the length of the coast in the world will be increased 5 times. We shall make new shallow places. We can't live in the deep sea. We shall need your land to fill up the deep parts. We have nothing against you, but there are too many of us. For the time being, you can move inland. You can withdraw to the mountains. The mountains will be pulled down last. You needed us. You have spread us about all over the world. Now you have us. We want to be on good terms with you. We will supply you with steel for our drills and pickaxes. You will supply us with explosives. We will work for you. You will work for us. Without you, we could not move old continents. Hello, you men. Chief Salamander, in the name of all the salamanders of the world, offers you collaboration. You will work with us in demolishing your world. We thank you." Then it says, the tired hoarse voice ceased, and only the tense roar as of machines or of the ocean could be heard. "Hello, hello, you men," came a croaking voice again. "Now we shall send out light music from your gramophone records. The next item on the program is The March of the Tritons from the monster film Poseidon." So I actually think that's really kind of a hilarious juxtaposition there, that basically the Newts have decided that in order to have living space for themselves, they are going to take the continents, and they offer to pay for them in gold, to pay for the land so that they can sort of drive it into the sea, move the land into the deeper parts of the ocean to raise the level of that so that they can live, etc., etc. But then they play this like light dance music or something. I think it's a brilliant juxtaposition. But this is where the thing comes in terms of, I'm not sure who's supposed to be the Nazis if we're reading this novel as an allegory of the rise of Nazism. Because for most of the novel, it seems like human beings are. They are capturing, enslaving, torturing, really in the name of medical experimentation, these Newts. They essentially militarize them. They treat them as a labor force, but they also, again, are doing these horrific experiments on them that actually are... I mean, this book came out in 1938, I think, which is when Capek died, which is actually the only reason he wasn't arrested by the Nazis, who did arrest his brother, who then died in a concentration camp. But Capek sort of anticipates the kind of brutal medical scientific experiments done by somebody like Joseph Mengele in Auschwitz. So, I mean, like the guy that Capek describes as this sort of medical doctor experimenting on the Newts does things like he freezes them and then thaws them out. He dismembers them and sees how long it takes their limbs to regrow. He exposes them to direct sunlight and then tries to sort of revive them with water and stuff like this. It's just brutal, brutal stuff in the name of science. And so and there is this one portion here where I just wrote Nazi shit in the margin because it definitely is. It's in this chapter called Der Nordmalach, which means the northern newt, or the north newt. Basically what they find is that in the Baltic, newts start undergoing physiological adaptations. There are changes. It says here, it was somewhat lighter in color, it walked more erect, and its cranial index gave evidence of a longer and narrower skull than was the case with other newts. And so, the German press, according to this, it says, after that, the German press began to take an eager interest in the Baltic newt. Special stress was laid on the fact that it was just in response to the German milieu that this newt had developed into a divergent and higher racial type, indisputably superior to all the other salamanders. With contempt, they described the degenerate Mediterranean newts, stunted both physically and morally, the savage tropical newts, and altogether the low barbarian and bestial salamanders of other nations. From the giant salamander to the German super newt, thus ran the winged phrase of the time. Was not the origin of all modern newts to be found on German soil? Was not their cradle near Onningen, where the German scientist Dr. Johannes Jakob Schauzer first discovered their superb imprints as early as the Miocene? There was, therefore, no doubt that the original Andreas Schauzer, which is the Latin name for the newts, was born geological ages before on German soil. If later on it migrated to other seas and zones, it paid dearly for it by its evolutionary descent and degeneration, but as soon as it again settled on the soil of its fatherland, it became again what it had been originally, a noble Nordic newt Schauzer, fair, erect, doliocephalic. Don't know what that means, I'm sorry. Therefore, only on German soil could the newts return to their pure and highest type, as the great Johannes Jakob Schauzer had founded in the imprint of the Onningen quarries. Therefore, Germany needed new and larger coasts, it needed colonies, it needed oceans, so that everywhere new generations of racially pure or original German salamanders could develop in German waters. We need more space for our newts, wrote the German papers. Yeah, it's fucking Nazi shit. It's just straight up racial nonsense bullshit. So we've got all of that going on. But then at the end of the novel, it is the newts who are claiming territory in the name of gaining more space to live, what the Nazis called Lebensraum, or living room. For most of the novel, I'm extremely sympathetic to the newts because they are getting fucked over. They were just out there living their lives in this fucking tropical bay, just hanging out, chilling, not doing anybody any harm. And then all of a sudden, as a species, they're basically enslaved. They're transported all over the world. So in that sense, not really anything like the rise of Nazism. Whereas the sort of ethnic superiority, the willingness to utilize resources, the segregation of newt and human populations that arises as newt numbers grow along coastlines, that stuff's all kind of Nazi-ish, but not necessarily directly enough. It's not explicit enough that if you just read the novel without the context of Capek is writing this in the 1930s in Czechoslovakia, that you would necessarily say, yeah, that's Nazi shit. You would just say, yeah, that's bad stuff that's going on. So I don't know that that's clear enough. On the other hand, at the end of the novel, the newts are again basically just taking land in the name of Lebensraum, which is a Nazi concept. But until the last maybe 50 pages or so, hard to really see the newts as in any way comparable to Nazis. So I don't know that I'm super sold on this. I think this novel is much more in line with something like RUR, where you have a subject population. And this is one of the great storylines of science fiction, right? You have a subject population who are under the control of, and often in a way, the creation of. In RUR, they're directly the creation of human beings. In War with the Newts, they're a biological creation of human beings, but the population of newts as such, the scope of the newt population is definitely a result of human activity. And that enslaved population, that subject population, turns around and destroys humanity that had so exploited them. I think we see that in both RUR and War with the Newts. And so to me, that's a much more compelling reading of this novel.